Hello. My name's Dawn Janney Burley. I'm the artistic director of my theatre company called 1S1 Theatre. Prince Hamlet was a landmark show, a novel theatrical experiences for audiences, deaf and hearing, signing and non-signing. But like many deaf-hearing collaborations, it wasn't without challenges. As a deaf artist, I've seen the same mistakes repeat in different projects. And I've asked myself, why do these patterns continue to emerge? What needs to shift, not just on the stage, but behind the scenes, in rehearsal rooms, in leadership? This conversation is not about blame. It's about learning. Learning how to collaborate better, listen more deeply, and take real accountability. I'm inviting Miriam from Why Not Theatre into this space to reflect with me on the process, on the impact, and the things we might not have gotten right the first time. My hope is that this dialogue becomes a resource, especially for hearing artists and hearing companies who are interested in collaborating and working with deaf artists in ways that are artistically rich, that are grounded in equity and creative integrity, that are rooted in deep listening, shared leadership, and a recognition of deaf artistry as being central, not merely an add-on. We met during the production of Prince Hamlet. But before that, can you talk a little bit about your level of awareness of deaf people, ASL? Was I the first deaf person that you'd met? Talk about where you started from.
You weren't the first deaf person I met, but you were the first deaf person I had a real relationship with. Like, I had met people before, but but I didn't know the language or I didn't understand the culture. So I didn't really engage. Yeah.
Right. Engage. You didn't engage.
So I was just kind of like, hi, bye. But when you and I met and we started working together and became friends, and our friendship grew,
Grew. That's the sign.
and then I really wanted to just talk to you more and more and more. So I feel like that's why I learned sign language, because I just wanted to talk directly to you.
Yeah. That always is really touching when my friends make the effort to learn how to sign, because it's different when you're working with an interpreter. And I've used interpreters my whole life, but direct communication is always really powerful. So I'm curious if you can speak from your perspective. What's the difference for you when we're communicating directly versus when we're communicating through interpretation? Can you speak to that?
It's interesting. I feel like that changed because in time I've been learning more and more sign language and I've become more confident signing. Because before, when I used an interpreter, I didn't understand a lot. So I really needed an interpreter to talk to me. And now that, for really to understand the complexities of what you're saying. But now the more I understand, I realize that I have to use a different part of my brain. So for example, if the interpreter is speaking and I'm listening primarily, well, that's my first language. So I'll listen to what the interpreter is saying, and that takes priority.
Priority.
I can't really watch as much when I'm listening. But if there's no talking, if there's no interpreter, nobody speaking, and I have to watch, I have to work harder to understand that. And it's okay if I don't understand everything. I'll ask, can you slow down? Or what does that word mean? So I really, I need to work harder, but now I understand how I can't, like, if I'm listening to someone speaking, then it's really, really hard for me to prioritize the signing, the visual. And similarly, I can't talk and sign because the languages are not the same. So I need to choose one, either signing or speaking. And that I understand a lot better now that I sign more. Before I didn't really understand. I I just didn't understand. But now the more I can sign, the more I understand.
I feel like I've taught you well, because clearly you're a good student when
Yeah.
I see you signing that.
Thank you. And it's funny because it's true. You are an amazing teacher. And I realized the more that I realize more and more that I need to experience it for myself, because from the start, you have said, no, you can't speak and sign at the same time. You can't do that. And I didn't understand why. But the more I understand sign, the more I realize, oh, it's not the same as English. So, yes, it's true. You taught me that, and I learned it, but I learned it by doing it. Like, I really needed to experience that for myself. I think, yeah, we'll talk more about it. But when I realized, when I reflected on it, when we were working together, I realized how much I need to experience by myself. And yeah, alongside you together. But I understood that it really takes time, like it's slow. And I need to understand things again and again and again to actually go deeper and, yeah, for it to sink in.
That's so beautiful, Miriam. I think you are a really wonderful example of this process. I remember when we first met and worked together and engaged in that first process, there were many things that happened along the way. And what you're saying really leads to my next question really beautifully. So, as you're learning sign and engaging in direct communication, I'm wondering, I think that it helps you to understand me better and the deaf community's language and culture. And I think that has an impact on the working experience. And I'm wondering if you can reflect on that, how that assists in your understanding.
I remember right now, like when you said that, okay, I'm going to go back. The first time we worked together was on Prince Hamlet. The first time was 2017. Yeah, 2017. Yeah. And that was my first time working with a deaf collaborator. And that process was eye opening for me because I was an actor in the process. So I was searching and I was trying to understand. I was trying to figure out how I fit in and how you fit in and how are we going to do this together? And that room, that rehearsal room, was full of hearing people. It was all hearing people and one deaf person and two interpreters. And I remember you telling me, you need to understand deaf culture. You need to be immersed. Immersed, yeah. Immersed. I love that. That's beautiful. Yeah. Immersed. That's a beautiful sign. Yeah, so you told me you need to be immersed in the culture to really understand it, to understand what I mean. And you invited me to the Clin d'œil festival in France. And that was my first time really being immersed in deaf culture. And that was shocking, so surprising to me because it was the first time that in my life, I'm going to go back for a second. I love languages. I love traveling and seeing different cultures and different languages. But I'm used to, when I travel, I can always talk. And I can always understand tonality. If there's words I don't understand, if I don't understand the language, the tone I can kind of recognize. But being immersed in deaf culture at Clin d'oeil, I was shocked. That was really crazy for me. It was something else. It was something completely different because the culture was so rich, and it was so I was the minority. People from all over the world were there with different languages, different cultures, and as well, and everybody was deaf. And I realized I need to watch and figure out what's happening, because and everyone was so open. Everybody was signing, and in my experience of the world was just different because I was the minority. So for me that was a huge change for me in understanding your world.
So now I reflect at that time and your beginning, your early understanding of me and my world. And as hearing artists who want to collaborate and work with deaf artists, from my perspective, I certainly have my own take on that, but I'm curious about your take as a hearing artist who is, beginning to collaborate with a deaf artist. And I'm wondering what your perspective is. Should hearing people have at least some degree of basic understanding of deaf culture and some basic sign proficiency before beginning a collaboration? Or do you think it's okay or effective for people who don't have any of that experience to enter into collaborations?
I think it's always helpful to have some understanding of a language or a culture, always. But to me, I think the most important thing is to be open. And if you don't sign, if you don't know deaf culture, I think that's okay. But if you're open to sitting in the back seat and realizing I'm not the center of this, I think you just need to listen. You need to watch to understand. Because, how do I explain this? I think it's easy for hearing people to take control without realizing it. And I think a lot of that is because of the time. In the theater, we're always, we never have enough time. So we just want to rush. We want things to go fast. And that's so easy in that to leave out the deaf collaborators. Just rush ahead without them. And just the hearing people just talk over each other, and that's always a bad thing. So I think if you're open to sitting back and listening and really changing your relationship to time, that's the most important thing to me, I think.
Thanks for sharing that perspective, Miriam. I can share as a deaf artist most of the time when I am working with hearing collaborators, and I can foresee what will happen. I anticipate things that happen, but I know that I need to be patient and work through the process. And it's difficult when those mistakes get repeated over and over. So now I think it's important to have this opportunity to discuss with you Prince Hamlet. I appreciate this openness of mind and heart, and I hope that this conversation can be of use to people who will be able to view it and learn a little bit about hearing and deaf collaborations that are really effective, because that's my dream. That's why I established my theater company, 1S1 Theater, because it's my belief that hearing and deaf people can work together, because deaf people haven't had access, and we certainly want to change that. So let's go back in time to 2017, to 2019, and to 2022, those 3 productions. We ran this play, Prince Hamlet, 3 times. And as you reflect on each of those processes, the play was the same. Essentially, the production was the same. Our artistic vision wasn't different in each of these productions, but our process was. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the differences that were between those 3 productions and why they were there.
Okay. I think I need an interpreter now. Okay. The first time we made Prince Hamlet was 2017. And I think the biggest defining feature of that process was the fact that we were making the show for the first time. We came into the process, and Ravi, who was the director, had had a conversation with you beforehand and said, do you want to do this version of Hamlet? I think you should tell the story of that conversation. But you agreed, and it was a process where you were the only deaf artist. It was 1 deaf artist and 8 hearing artists, and a hearing director. And we were working on Hamlet. And there was an idea of how we would collaborate and integrate the languages, but there was no real map when we came in on that first day of rehearsal. And so I would say, like, we had 5 weeks, which at that time was a really long process for our company, Why Not Theater. A Canadian process is usually 2.5 weeks. But so we had 5 weeks.
Which I think is just wild. In a deaf way of working, there's no way that it could be done in 2 weeks. And that was, very fortunate that we did have additional time.
Yeah.
Proceed.
So we had 5 weeks of rehearsal and a week of tech to figure this whole thing out. And it was, I remember on the first day of rehearsal, Ravi, it was a group of people. He had brought together a group of people because it was the 10th anniversary of Why Not Theater. And the first show he had ever done to kind of launch the company was a production of Hamlet that he had adapted. And it was an international team, and it was kind of in like a visual, physical style as he came back from Lecoq. And so that was in 2007. So in 2017, he wanted to revisit this adaptation, but really questioning who gets to tell this story. And so the casting already was culturally diverse, gender bent. There was a female Hamlet, a male Ophelia. Lots of things were turned on their heads, and a deaf Horatio. You played Horatio. And so Ravi kind of introduced this idea. We want to challenge who gets to tell the story. And then I remember he passed it to you to talk a little bit about deaf-hearing collaboration and specifically about intersectionality and the difference between inclusion and intersectionality. And do you want me to tell the story, or do you want to tell this part of the story?
Yeah, I'm really interested in your perspective,
Yeah.
so I'd like you to tell it.
So I remember you saying, we were all sitting around this big table in this tiny room. And I remember you explaining this idea of inclusion. And you talked about like there being a sea. And the idea of inclusion means that as a deaf person, you get dropped into this sea of hearing people. And everything just kind of gets watered down. Yeah.
That's right, disappear.
Yeah. So you're included in the process, but the uniqueness of who you are and your language and culture are not really met because it just gets diluted in this hearing world. Because there's way more of us than you in this room. Whereas an intersectional process is the image of like all of us having kind of floating mats on the sea. I
Yay, you remember.
Yeah.
Apparently that made an impression.
And that it allows each of us to hold on to who we are and go somewhere together. But none of us has to water down our identities for that process to happen. And again, at that time, it felt like, it was like, oh, wow, what a beautiful image, what a beautiful idea. And so that was like an intellectual thing. But the next 5-6 weeks was experiencing how do we do that. And I remember there were, we said at the beginning, and you had to keep asking throughout, like, who is this show for? Is it for hearing people with like an exotic deaf performer in the middle to do some beautiful sign language? Or is it for both hearing and deaf people? And should it have an impact on both those audiences? And should it have an equitable experience for both of those audiences? And of course, the answer was, yeah, we want an equitable experience. We want it to be for both deaf and hearing audiences. And so then the question was how? Because the script was completely in English. 8 out of the 9 actors were speaking English. 1 actor was signing when we started. And so the process of creating that piece was really, it felt like a constant collision of those cultures. And I remember, because at first you needed time to translate too. You went, like you said, Ravi, I'm going to have to translate this whole thing. So we were working parallel. Because you would be in the back room translating, and we would be outside doing a first draft of staging. And I remember when Ravi showed you all of part 1, act 1, you sat and watched, and we were all like stumbling through this process, like trying to remember what we were doing. And at the end of act 1, you looked at Ravi and you're like, you want my honest feedback? And he was like, yeah, tell me your honest feedback. And you're like, deaf people aren't going to understand anything. This is so boring. And he was like, what? It's physical. There'll be lights. And you're like, yeah, there's no language. There's no sign language. Like, they're not going to understand anything. And so we went, oh, shit. Okay, so Dawn has to be there all the time, actually, if we're trying to create an experience where the deaf audience is experiencing and receiving the whole story at the same time. What we're actually creating is 2 parallel shows in one show.
Yeah, and again, also it's who's telling the story, who's receiving it, but also who's telling the story had an impact as well. Yeah, it really did become 2 parallel processes.
That we only put together in tech. Because it's true. And I think what was beautiful about Hamlet is that question of who's telling the story. Shakespeare actually proposes that it's Horatio. Because at the end of the story, our adaptation starts with the end of the story, which is, spoiler alert, everybody has died. Horatio's the only person living and says, I'm going to tell you this terrible tale. And so we start at the end. And so Shakespeare really proposes that Horatio is the teller of the story. And so we took that on and went, okay, what if Horatio is the storyteller? Which allowed us to put you at the center of the whole show. Which was a discovery during rehearsal. That's not something that Ravi came in with in any way.
Exactly. And it was a beautiful discovery because it became the fundamental tone and intention of the play. That opening ASL piece with the voiceover that came after, that was beautiful. So that had a very, very initial impact on the audience that set the tone and introduced them to this manner of storytelling.
And I would say even before that, the fact that we went on stage and introduced ourselves and signed our names, that was also setting the tone for the audience.
Yeah. And that was so new for me. That has never happened before. I thought it was a brilliant discovery that we had.
Yeah, the fact that we were making the show for the first time, it was special and unique because it had that kind of energy that you have when you're trying to do something that you've never done before. And for all of us, like all 8 of us, hearing actors plus Ravi, the director, we'd never worked with a deaf artist before. And you had clearly worked with a lot of hearing people, so you had a huge advantage on us because you knew, like, these are the things we have to avoid. This is the way we have to go. And you and Ravi had a really, I would say, like, you had a very honest and open communication. And you battled and you disagreed, but we always found our way together, which is right. Like, it's not bad to disagree. But there was a lot of respect for each other in that and what we were trying to create together. And I would say what was special as like a cast, for hearing people, like we were for the hearing actors, we were constantly in the position of like, already when you're making something for the first time, it's so vulnerable. You're trying to remember your lines. You're trying to figure out what you're doing. You don't know if you look like an idiot. You don't know if what you're proposing is working. And then on top of that, there's somebody else on stage with us all the time. And we realized, I think only in tech, how important the timing was, and how, because the fact that you were telling the story meant that you had to drive the pace of the show. And again, it's easy for hearing people to get carried away, to speak really fast, especially when we're nervous, and to be responding to each other and not keeping an eye out for a visual cue. And so what would happen was we would get carried away and we would go too fast, and suddenly the scene was over for the hearing actors, but you were still in the scene. And it was like, oh, it felt like egg on everybody's faces, especially for you. It's terrible. It was a terrible thing. And so we realized in the tech process that we needed to build in visual cues throughout so that the hearing actors were constantly signaling to you where we were, and that the hearing actors understood certain cues from you where you were at, so that if at any point, if either of the trains was going too fast, we could adjust in between. And like that was a fundamentally, it's like doing this. It is, because you're doing two things at once. You're trying to drive this story and be true to the emotion and the scene and the scene partners that you're with, and also hold this larger world of the story that we're telling for two audiences. And I think the challenge of that was super hard, but also the reward of finding that together was super satisfying. And I think something happens when you go through a struggle together, through a challenge together. And because there was so much trust in the process and in Ravi and you from on behalf of all the team, and it felt like there was a mutual trust and respect. Even in that unknown, it felt like, okay, we're driving towards something, we don't know what it is, but we found something together that, in my experience in theater, you never find unless you go into that space of real unknown. And it felt like we were in that.
Yeah, that process was exciting and simultaneously terrifying. From my perspective of that process, the entire production worked because we were both really listening and watching and attending carefully to one another. And in that 2017 process, it was such a discovery for me too. It was such an exciting and challenging discovery. And for me too, it felt like I had found something new. And the new thing for me was the power to tell a story, to drive the story. And it was in that process that I really discovered the difference between our first and second production. Because you're right, the first one was messy, and when we found something, when it clicked, in that moment, in that last week, where and what had clicked meant that I suddenly had a whole lot of more work to do to memorize my lines, everybody else's lines. I was in the story the whole time. I always use, when I'm describing these, I use soup as a metaphor. This is my soup metaphor. Our first 2017 run, we made a really delicious soup. It was a good soup. It was a little thin, but it was good. Then the second one, when most of the cast returned with only one substitute member, everybody else had returned. And in the meantime, it was different because those cast members who learned ASL had a deepened understanding of the language and the culture. There wasn't the sort of fear and tentativeness or trepidation that there had been at the beginning of the first process. We could just dive right into that collaboration. And I was able to therefore spend more time on my translation, and we made a beautiful, creamy, rich soup. We were able to convey more information from the first story to the deaf audience, pieces that were missing out of the first story in ASL. And so we struck a better balance in terms of carrying the narrative and the plot. And we were able to really engage in the fun of it in the second time. And then when we moved to our third production, we faced really substantial challenges that surprised me in many ways. And in other ways, I anticipated it. I don't know if you want to talk about the third production and the differences. I'm curious from your perspective what it was different compared to the earlier two productions. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. So I think the biggest unanticipated challenge for all of us in that third production was the fact that we thought we were replacing one person in the cast. And we ended up replacing 5 people. That was not the intention. It's for a million reasons, and people got contracts and all of these things. It changed quite late in the game on us and on you, the fact that we were replacing all of these people.
Just to clarify, yes, absolutely. It was a surprise, the number. We thought that most people would be able to return, and it didn't happen that way. But I did anticipate things would happen and began to, I guess I began to address those, but those conversations didn't take enough space, and we can talk more about that later. So I want to get back to your perspective.
Yeah. I think the third version was very challenging, and I think we can both speak to it. But I think there were two things that were the two major challenges were the fact that we had a new cast, a completely new cast, or half a new cast, and I think that we didn't understand intimately the impact that that would have on you and the translation until the very end of the process, like way, way, way too late. That was a huge oversight, and we should talk about that. The second was, I think there was a sense of urgency that was driving Ravi, the director, and therefore the process that was really unhelpful and caused us to make a lot of mistakes that were unnecessary. But I would say, like, in a nutshell, those were the two main challenges that caused a million other problems and questions.
I would agree with your categorization of these two main problems, but I would say that those both were based on the fundamental problem of the process not being initiated as a bilingual process. So if we go back to the approach of the whole process, if we had done it bilingually, then those two wouldn't have emerged as the main challenges. It would have been different. So the new cast, for sure, you raised that. And I knew and anticipated some of those challenges because the translation depended on the delivery of the lines. And so what was new for me was that I thought we would be able to make minor adjustments to the translation that had been finalized in the second production in 2019. But in 2022, I realized how much my translation depended on the intention and understanding of that was reflected in the delivery of the line by the individual cast member who was performing it. And so I needed to meet with each of the cast members to reflect on the translation of my translation of their lines, not my lines, but their lines that I was performing. And so I needed to understand how they were performing. And additionally, so that was one challenge, but also the new cast members needed time. I could meet them, but it was really hard for them to meet me in the time that they had because they were figuring out their character, figuring out their lines, how they were fitting, and at the same time figuring out what it meant to be working with me. And had there been 2 or 3 new cast members, maybe we could have made it work. But given the number of cast members that were new to this process, we just didn't have the time, I felt, to do it. I think had we invested more time at the beginning of the process, we could have avoided some of the missteps if we had had more time invested in what it meant to work with a deaf person, deaf sensitivity training, language, culture exposure, because for many of these cast members, it was entirely new.
I 100% agree. I think there were 2 big missteps too at the beginning of the process. Number 1 was that on day 1, we didn't start with you leading the room in a way. We didn't start with an introduction to deaf culture and deaf language and what it means to have a deaf-led process in the way that we did at the very first process.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. That was a big misstep.
And so, we didn't start on the right foot. And then we made a lot of assumptions about how, quote unquote, quickly we could plug and play different actors. Because we assumed that we made the show already. Now we just need to do a remount, which means the show stays exactly the same, and we just put a new actor into it, which is what hearing people do. If we're doing a remount, technically that means the design stays the same, the choices of the actors stay the same. We're just putting actor B in for actor A. We're just switching somebody out. And in English, spoken English, you can do that. I can give somebody else this sheet of paper with Shakespeare written on it and say, I'm no longer Hamlet, you're Hamlet now. And you're going to speak the exact same text. And we profoundly did not understand that you can't do that with ASL. And it took us the entire tour, unfortunately, to understand that, because we didn't understand the impact that changing 5 actors out made on the translation. And I know Ravi and you struggled because he couldn't understand why you needed to retranslate. And the understanding came way too late. But it was because we made assumptions about the way that we work in English and that being the same in ASL, and that was clearly wrong.
And it was hard for me to explain that. And it was hard for me to explain it in a way that you could understand. And I had anticipated before the rehearsal, but I felt that some of my advice had been sidelined. And that's why I say that had the process been bilingual, it would have been different. We would have been looking at both languages equally. What is the impact of new cast and what the show needs and what the characters need from an English perspective, a hearing perspective, because we were really looking at what the show needs to work, right? That's what we're looking at. But if we had been looking at from the get-go what it needs to work in terms of both the spoken text and the sign text, we would have been off on a different foot. And as the process unfolded, the sidelining of the ASL became more and more problematic.
We would like to acknowledge and thank the Canada Council for the Arts for their support of us at 1S1 Theatre and Why Not Theatre and our company Exchange and Collaboration. The Canada Council for the Arts Sector Support, Innovation and Development Grant has enabled the creation of this 3-part Salon series. One salon is entitled Unpacking Common Mistakes in Deaf-Hearing Theatre Collaborations. Another explores 1S1 Theatre's deaf-led vision for the future. And then there is an interview with Why Not Theatre about their production, Prince Hamlet. The aim of the series is to generate a dialogue which can increase awareness of deaf-led work among those in the arts sector, and of the importance of giving us, as deaf artists, power, visibility, and space. All of your input, contributions, and experiences were vital to the creation of these conversations, which have become a resource for our community and for all the diverse communities in the sector, to share, foster collaboration, and serve as an inspiration so that together we can flourish and thrive. Thank you. And also, to Why Not Theatre, I want to offer my utmost and most heartfelt gratitude. Thank you for your unwavering support for 1S1 Theatre.